Good evening. I'm going to start now. Welcome to this first, rather experimental for me, Facebook event to celebrate the launch of the new Divine Art Athene label, fourth volume in my Great Violins series. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I think it's always good to begin with music, and this evening we'll be having some music which is not included in that album. I'm going to begin with music which I have no plans to record at the moment at all, and end with music which is going to appear on my next 17th century collection for Athene. So first of all, I will begin with a little piece from the first decade of the 18th century in Portugal. This is from the very large collection of solo violin pieces by the little-known Portuguese composer Nogueira. I'll put some information about him later. This is a piece called Filhota, the little girl, and it's the first of 7 tunings I'm going to be using today, and quite a rare tuning for the 18th century of A, E, B, E. So this is Nogueira's Filhota. Now, the violin I played this on is not the instrument which we're celebrating this evening. This is a Brescian instrument from the 1570s, and maybe even earlier, probably one of the earliest violins which is playable today. This will be the focus of a recording which I'll be making later this year to record the complete Westhoff 6 partitas and an extra solo sonata. But I'll come back to this instrument later. I think it's worth saying there's a kind of fun thing about this evening is we're celebrating early 18th century, very early 18th century music, recorded on an early 17th century violin. This is a 16th century violin. I'll be playing some 21st century music, which incorporates it within it 15th century music or 14th century music. So we're covering many of the bases. So let's go over to the Amati and begin to move towards Vilsmayr. This is the first movement to set us off, the very first movement of Vilsmayr's 6 Partias. This first partita has standard tuning. I'm doing everything today, including the new pieces at a low A at 4/16, which is my favourite low pitch. So this is the Prelude and Arpeggio from Partita 1. I'd like to talk about the violin first, because as some of you will know, this recording was made the first chunk of it was made just before lockdown happened in roughly this time last year, and the rest of the recording was made in the sort of the brief time off that we had in the summer, and that the situation we're all in the moment has this interesting relationship and sobering relationship with this violin. A lot of you will recognise this because this is the instrument which for the past 8 years I've played the most. It's labelled as being by the brothers Antonio and Girolamo Amati, and these were the 2 sons of Andrea Amati, who's generally credited with being the inventor or one of the inventors of what we now recognise as the modern form of the violin. That's the model which will be used by Antonio Stradivari and every maker, to be honest, of note since. From the 1560s onwards, when Amati fixes the proportions of the violin, fundamentally nothing much would change apart from the things we all know about: angles of fingerboards, bass bars and bridges, this kind of thing. The label inside the violin makes very clear that the brothers are claiming the lineage from their father. This is very important from them. And from the mid-1570s until 1588, Girolamo, who was born probably around about 1561 and died in 1630, and Antonio, who was 20 years older and died in 1610, collaborated under this joint brothers Amati moniker. But they ended their partnership, it seems, acrimoniously in 1588. That's the year of the Spanish Armada, just to get things into proportion. But Girolamo went on using the joint label. From about 1610, he was joined in the workshop by his son Niccolo. And the general consensus is that Niccolo's hand could be seen in most or many of the instruments that emerge under this label from the workshop until Girolamo's death. And Girolamo died in a catastrophic plague that swept through northern Italy from 1629 to 1630. And this was the worst since the Black Death in the mid-1300s. The pestilence arrived in October 1629, brought by Spanish and French troops who'd been involved in the war, the so-called War of the Mantuan Succession. And the disease spread quickly southwards, covering all of northern Italian peninsula, excluding Liguria, by the late spring, and then stopped in Tuscany. The death rates in the northern Italian cities were astonishing. And most people agree that the major urban centres of Lombardy and Cremona, the mortality rate was north of 500 into 1,000, which, writing this in the middle of what we're going through at the moment, makes one stop and think a bit. So it's probably very likely that this violin was one of the last on which Girolamo worked, and I find it very moving. And I found it very moving especially this year, because I hadn't really worked this out until I started looking into it this year, to imagine the father and son collaborating on this instrument only a few months before Girolamo died. And Niccolo found himself literally as not only in charge of the family firm, but sort of the dominant luthier, last man standing in some ways in the city. The front of the fiddle is spruce, and the back, an absolutely spectacular piece of slab cut maple, like the ribs. And also the head of the instrument, which I'm going to put up to the camera, is also slab cut. So you get the grain going across the scroll like that. That, to put it mildly, is showing off. It's the difficult way of doing things, and not the way that most makers would choose to do it, because it's so much harder. Having spent so many hours with this instrument in my hands, and having played some of the greatest instruments made by Niccolo after his father's death, my hunch is, and my feeling is, that I've always felt that Girolamo made the front and the head, and that Niccolo made the back. And this has a lot to do with the fact that the very first time I held one of the great Niccolo Amatis, the Brooking, which is in Washington, I had a huge shock of recognition when I turned it over and saw a back which looks and feels so much like this. So, although I've been able to record and played on this instrument quite a lot since 2013, and its extraordinary qualities have really influenced my approach to the violin as much, if not more, than the number of Stradivariuses that I was playing a lot before then. What's amazing about an instrument like that is there's no limit to its range. It doesn't matter whether I'm playing early music like today or later music. It seems to offer practically everything with room to spare. And that's what I'd like to celebrate today a little bit. To begin, set that off, I want to bring in the music of one of the living composers who has influenced me the most. And this is Sadie Harrison. And the reason I want to do this before we get to more Vilsmayr is to say something which might sound rather obvious, but needs to be said, which is, for me, one of the reasons that I can find my way to the music of the past is the insight which living composers give me. Their brilliance in being able to not only offer a window into working processes themselves as composers, but also to look to the past and to leap there, to see something wonderful. And Sadie, the two pieces I'm going to play by Sadie today play with this idea. The first of them is called Coffee with Afraben, Westminster Cathedral Cloisters, and it's related to a drawing that I did sitting with my family in the cloisters of Westminster Abbey, where the poet and writer Afraben is buried. And the music, you'll hear that the music which Sadie has used refers back much further to the 14th century. There's a Gloria in Excelsis which you'll hear, and I'm going to use it as a little prelude to a wonderful poem, which is our kind of finding our way back into the end of the 17th century. This poem is from 1671 by Afraben. I love the idea of music being used, preludes, as a proem, and I'm sure that Sadie will approve of this. So this is Coffee with Afraben, followed by this wonderful poem by Afraben herself. What care I, though the world reprove my bold, my over-daring love? Ignoble minds themselves exempt from interest in a brave attempt. The eagle soaring to behold the sun arrayed in flames of gold regards not, though she burns her wings, since that rich sight such pleasure brings. So feel I now my smiling thought to such a resolution brought, that it contemns all grief and smart, since I so high have placed my heart. And if I die, some worthy spirits to future times shall sing my merits, that easily did my life despise, yet ne'er forsook my enterprise. Then shine, bright sun, and let me see the glory of thy majesty. I wish to die, so I may have thy look my death, thine eye my grave. So now I want to talk a little bit about the Vilsmayr 6 partitas. The Latin title is worth bringing out in full. The full title of the piece, with the dedication, is as follows. Artificiosus concentus pro camera distributus 6 partes su Partias al violino solo con basso belli imitante. Celsissimo reverendissimo principio ac domino Francesco Antonio Archibispo Salzburgensis, sedis apostolica legato nato Germania primati, principi ab harat etc. principi ac domino suo clementissimo dedicatus a Josepho Vilsmayr, Celsitudines sue cubiculario et aule musico, anno domini etc. Which translates roughly a cunningly created thing for a chamber thing, distributed into 6 parts or partitas for violin solo with a good imitation of the bass, dedicated to the Most High Reverend Prince Bishop Francesco Antonio, Archbishop of Salzburg, Papal Legate, First Princes of the Germans, etc., etc. Dedicated to his most merciful master by Joseph Vilsmayr, and here's the fun bit, from the lofty heights of his cell to the halls of music. I just love that dedication, especially because there's some wonderfully, joyfully terrible Latin lurking in there. But it's also worth pointing out that this piece, which dates from a few years before Bach's sonatas and partitas, plays with a similar game which is on the front page of Bach's manuscript, where Bach wrote something which until the 20th century was almost unnoticed. He'd written what most people thought said 6 solos, and nobody noticed that the second word didn't agree, and no one educated and who matriculated in classics at 12 would write say solo and leave the agreement not working unless they're making a particular German joke, sei solo, be alone. And there's a link for me between that and the Vilsmayr's ironic remark from the dizzying heights of his cell to the halls of music, which I as well, perhaps within there is a little bit of a knowing joke about the long references which both poets and musicians in the 18th century, including Tartini, would make to the model set by Tasso, locked up, as he put it, in his cell in Ferrara, which is something which is played with again and again. So I'm going to highlight something in each of the partitas, and obviously the most obvious thing to do this is the journey of tuning. Now, Vilsmayr was a member of the Kapelle in Salzburg, a successful member of the Kapelle in Salzburg, which means that although we might not recognize it in our way of looking at it, he was an associate, maybe a pupil of Bieber, and obviously there is a relationship between what's going on with the tuning in these pieces and Bieber's cycle published 20 years earlier of what is now known as the Rosary Sonatas. There's an amazing set of 16 sonatas. These pieces begin and end with what we can now regard as standard tuning. And I want to point out some adventurous things about them and to observe what happens with the tuning. So I played you the prelude to the first of them. The whole set, the 6 pieces, have 58 movements, which should tell you how short the movements are, because Bach's sonatas and partitas taken in full have 35 movements. The finale of the first is really rather interesting. I'll just play it to you so you can hear what happens. Just a point, unlike the recording, which is recorded on gut strings, this instrument is modern. I don't apologise for it. Is a modern setup because that's what I'm doing at the moment. So we'll work like that. So this is the last movement. I'll play it and then tell you what happens. Wrong bow. Can't do that with a modern bow. Now, this might seem very overdramatic, but in none of the contemporaneous works or earlier works, the cycles of pieces for solo violin, I include the pieces which will be written around about the same time as this, such as the Bach and Telemann suites and partitas and sonatas, the pieces which were going to be written in Sweden a few years later by Henrik Roman, large cycles of pieces, and all the pieces prior, whether you're talking about the Bieber solo works, the 90 or 100 odd works of the Klagenfurt manuscript, which I recorded on the previous disc in this cycle, none of the works by Marini, none of the works by Matthäus, none of the works by Thomas Balthasar, the hundreds of solo works, which I know from this period, not once do I find an occasion of what you just heard, where a jig comes to a final note which is held over into a semi-improvised finale, as it's written here. And this is a kind of little ear tug by the composer. He's very interested in endings and very interested in dramatic endings, which for the beginning of the 18th century in instrumental music is comparatively rare. None of Bach's orchestral suites or the Brandenburg concertos have what you might recognize as anything approaching codas. They tend, as we all know, to end more with a reverence or something gracious. So, but Vilsmayr, I don't want to say he's looking to the future, but he's doing something very interesting, I think. So, and I want to observe what happens. So we go from standard tuning, and then we take the top string down. Now, the first person to give cyclic performances in the 20th century of Salzburg scordatura works was actually Paul Hindemith, who was the first modern player to give a cyclical performance of the Rosary sonatas. And he was very worried about these retunings, and I understand it, but he had people backstage retuning the instruments and settling them down and handing them to him. I understand why he was doing that, but I think there was a slight misunderstanding. I'm pretty sure that part of what I just did was designed to be heard. So we just go from that bright key, the instrument tunes is taken down, and then, like all the other movements, all the other partias, it begins with a prelude, which sort of helps the player find their way, and the instrument to find its way into its new colour and its new physical feeling. So we find our way in gently, like this. the very obvious thing to say is that when you take the top string down a tone, the violin gets a darker quality because there's less pressure on the treble side of the instrument. Effectively, this side of the instrument rises up a little bit. So it becomes darker, but also this side becomes less pinched, if you like. And that movement of the instrument is an actual vital integer in what's going on. So I'll just push on. So the next movement takes it a stage further. So we began open and light. We started to close the instrument down, ironically by taking pressure off, which is always interesting. The next movement takes the top string down a further tone. Now, as I'm sure you can immediately realise, what's fascinating is when you have the instrument, the top two strings, a major third away from each other, that produces not only a very particular kind of peppery feeling to the instrument, but also it means that when you play in thirds on the top strings, which are played using a fifth fingering, it does something very particular to the tuning of thirds. Listen to this. Now, I said that Vilsmayr was very interested in endings, and you may have noticed that in that binary movement, I repeated the last 4 bars again. This is something which he marked. This is oddly less common, although it was clearly used a great deal as a device, but it's less common for it to be marked in Northern European composers, but very common to be marked in Italian composers, such as Lonati, who is an exact contemporary of Bieber's. And later, Tartini would use it again and again and again. And I would draw attention later to how Bieber plays with this game in a very interesting way, where he does a 4-bar repeat at the end of something and then hooks another 2 bars into it. So you get 8 bars repeated for the whole repeat section, then the last 4 bars repeated, and then the last 2 bars repeated within that. Just listen, let's just settle this down. This is going to sound strange, but another thing which is not unique but particular about these pieces and uncommon is expressive markings to give you a very, very clear indication of the expression you should be aiming for. The movement I'm going to play you now from this C minor sonata, which you can hear, it's even that minuet was absolutely dark and quite miserable. There is an aria lamentevole, an adagio, a lamenting aria, lamenting song. And at this point, it's important to observe the obvious, which is the scordatura. The darkening of the scordatura is absolutely in line with what the key colour was doing. So we started in A major with this bright open sound. We then moved to G minor, although that piece actually begins in B flat, darkening it. And now we're in C minor. The instrument has darkened further. And all the much discussed associations of key colour, which is absolutely clear, were regarded, didn't matter what your movable A was. And speaking as somebody who doesn't have perfect pitch but has pretty good relative pitch, I found, because I use different A's all the time, that key colour is a movable thing. It's a movable relative thing. So the reason I'm just going to push on that a little bit is what happens now, which I will just demonstrate. It's always interesting when in a concert to strategize what you're going to do next, because I believe passionately that, like the Bach sonatas and partitas and the Telemann fantasies, these pieces are designed to be played as a group. I know from doing it and from the recording that the whole set takes 82 minutes to play without stopping, with all the repeats. So at this point, we're coming up to the halfway point. We're roughly, in fact, just over halfway when we get to this point. And the movement which ends this part here ends like this. You'll notice there's a lot of use of marked unisons. But this is what happens to the tune now. So the A is all that remains constant. Now, I found something very interesting, which is when you tune an instrument sequentially like this, it's very different from, say, coming to the tuning we're just going to now, from the standard, if we can call it standard tuning. Effectively, it's finding its way by a different route. The actual architecture of the instrument is different. But we just went from C minor, that dark tuning, to this new tuning, and we get this. Of course, here we are in Catholic Salzburg. It's completely impossible to conceive of a composer working within Prince Bishop's court, being brought up like Bieber, and Bieber was too, in that religious observance, and not feel what's happening when you go from that darkness to light. I don't think I need to say any more than that, but it certainly means that there's more than a sense there is something, if not spiritual, liturgical going on there. The people who dwelt in darkness have seen a great light. It's illustrated both in terms of key and also in terms of the way the instrument is finding its way out of the gloom, if you like. A technical thing, which is an interesting challenge when you first start playing scordatura, and some people find it a little awkward, is that, so for instance, to play in D major as I am there, with the tuning like this, the key signature running from the top is the top of the instrument, the D string, the top D string has to be marked in A major. So you have an F sharp, a C sharp and a G sharp on the top of the stave, but the bottom of the instrument has to be played in C major. So for instance, that, to get that going down to the dominant there, I'm playing in C major, but here, playing D to A, I'm playing in A major. Whereas the previous movement, to play in C minor, the top of the instrument is in G major and the bottom of the instrument is in C minor. The really interesting thing about it for me is that once you've started doing it for a while, you don't see this or hear it as being tablature. You look at the notes on the page and you hear them. It's worth saying that this practice only really emerged of notating like this in the second half of the 17th century. Earlier writers using it, such as Marini in the 1620s, wrote the notes that they wanted to hear. So if we move on to the next movement, as you can imagine, what starts to happen is the instrument is going to move itself back towards where it started. So the two top strings remain as they've arrived, the A and D, and the bottom strings drop. And when you've done this for a few years, you start not choosing the pitch by some kind of tuning system, or it's more that you get to know the various different kind of flavors that come from the slight different spicy ways of one instrument, one string being slightly off in a certain direction. So I find for G minor, like I'm going to be, the top D string being a tad sharp is kind of interesting. So you get this. This partita also has a very bizarre shaped final movement. So it's just, where actually the last movement is actually marked a retirada, a retreat. And when I played this movement, I always have in mind the almost contemporaneous, a little bit earlier, quite a lot earlier, the wonderful portrait of the Night Watch of the most famous painting of Rembrandt. But what's exciting about it is twofold. One, it's got dynamic contrasts marked in, which is there's not much marked in, like in most Baroque music. Most dynamic contrasts marked in are echo effects. But the echo effects which have been marked in here are upside down. It's pianoforte. So I'm going to play you this final movement of this and just point out a couple of things before I play it. One, the upside down under echo effects. And which, you know, I won't get into what these have to do with contemporaneous and earlier theatre, but also want to point out that this movement also is marked a retreat, a final retreat, but also has a coda. After the petite reprise, the repeat of the last couple of bars, it has a four bar envoi referring back to that, as he marks, arpeggio movement that I began with. This is almost unheard of in instrumental Baroque music of the time. I don't want to say it's revolutionary, and it could simply be because Vilsmayr didn't really know what he was doing, or that he was a true inventor. So here's the retirada. All the dynamics I'm playing at the beginning are exactly as written. So then the last movement returns to where the tuning began. Will do in a minute. A lot of you will have noticed that last movement ended with a tierce de Picardy. We found ourselves into the major. It's worth saying that 17th century violin music, particularly from Austria and northern Italy, is littered with marked tierce de Picardy, sometimes to an irritating degree. When you're working very, very hard on holding on to a sort of a very, very melancholy little slow movement, it can be a little jarring to be faced again and again with the insistence you go into the major. It's the same with the Klagenfurt manuscript. Sometimes you have to just say to yourself, oh no, it's a little bit like the end of the first movement of the Bach double violin concerto, which has a tierce de Picardy, which I'm rather averse to. But of course, these are all things which are within the scope of the improvising musician's control at the time. So when a composer marks it, there's an interesting question of what you should do. And we've gone back into the home tuning. And before I go to the last partia, I'd like to go back to Sadie Harrison again. Because Sadie was one of the people who really brought me home to the 17th century. I wasn't playing a lot of 17th century music until about 9 years ago, when I started working closely on the obvious Bieber pieces, the pieces which everybody plays. And she sent me this delightful meditation on the Bieber Passacaglia, the aim. And this piece, as you'll hear, includes Bieber's descending scale, and I won't say anything about the piece except to say that this is an illustration of what I'm talking about. It's not the function of composers to help me find my way to the past, but this exquisite delicacy of what Sadie had did here. And this was, as some of you will know, she's written me a lot of music. We've worked together for 3 decades. But this is extremely special to me. The title is Ballare una Passacaglia di Ombre, Dancing a Passacaglia of Shadows. Was there ever a better title for what the music of turn of the 1700s Salzburg was doing? At this point, it's worth saying that I really want to say how grateful I am to Stephen Sutton at Divine Art for producing work which is this beautiful. Not only are these discs. Not that they sound wonderful, they make me sound much better than I am. You'll find that inside Stephen allows me to have the notes that I want. So you'll find there's really very over fanciful, because I wrote them, notes about the music, about the instrument. There are pictures. It really is a dream to have an opportunity to do something which celebrates music and celebrates the violin in the way that this disc does. If you're interested, anybody who is in on this session, if you Facebook messages, I am able to offer you, I'm going to suddenly market stall, this at a ridiculous discount. I've got a certain number which I can send to you. Just Facebook message me for those. I just want to give another illustration of Stephen's work. Some of you would have seen this as well. This is the cover and the disc that he did for my recent Schubert disc with the great keyboardist Julian Perkins. It's just wonderful to have the opportunity to produce material where there's so much thought gone into the quality of how things are presented. You know, when you've spent years labouring on something, and then because working with my wonderful engineer Jonathan Haskell, fighting for months to get something right, it really means such a lot when a recording company then matches that with the absolute love they put into the final product. It's been my real honour to be associated with Métier and de Weinard since 1999. I think this is probably my, apart from chamber recordings and the Beethoven cycle and all quartet work we've done and all the new music, this is my 8th unaccompanied disc for them, and there's and more coming. We just finished work on the editing work on my next solo disc of 17th century music, which I'll talk about in a minute. To finish with a little bit more about of the Vilsmayr, from the final Partias, and then something from, if you like, the what's coming. So I'll just play a little bit of the final set. The last Partia, the last partita, he calls them Partias, is the largest. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 movements, finishing with a large set of variations. There are 3 chaconne-like passacaglia pieces in the whole thing. But I'm going to play you a rather lovely Aria Adagio from the middle of it. I said that I was going to finish with something which talks about what's coming. I'm going to return to the Brescian violin and to our 7th tuning of the day. So we started, as you may remember, like this, and we're going to go here. pure A major tuning, A, C sharp, for two movements from a Scordatura suite, or a set of tunings, as he calls them, by Thomas Balthasar, who John Evelyn called the Lübecker. Like so many of the great musicians working in London at the middle to the end of the 1700s, he was of German origin and came from Lübeck. He didn't live very long. He only lived to be 31, died in 1661, but left an indelible mark on music making. And it's interesting even to see how much people like Purcell, who was only 5 when he died, clearly were influenced by what he did. So I'm going to play the final two movements of Courante and a beautiful saraband, which finishes this set of tunings. It's interesting, playing Scordatura very much feels like what everybody is familiar with from gamba consort concerts, where there's the kind of endless tuning is very, very much part of the music. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to stress with how we as violinists approach Scordatura. We shouldn't hide from that. And I suspect, in listening to gamba music and listening to lute music, listening to the tuning, and even listening to the way that musicians in Central Asia, for instance, incorporate tuning into their practice, I feel that not hearing this in some ways is losing some of the music. I don't think I could persuade a recording company to leave it on, but certainly in concerts, I wouldn't want to miss it. Also, I want to make sure this G string is where, this A string is where it should be. Okay, a Courante and a sarabanda by Thomas Balthasar to finish with. I've decided you need another 2 minutes of Sadie Harrison, particularly because this last tiny thing I want to play is very much about our home. So this is a piece that she wrote for my wife Melina, and celebrating Melina's tendency to tell lots of fairy stories. So it has the title Scheherazade. So this is to finish with Sadie Harrison's Scheherazade for Melina. So that's it. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you, as I said, if you're interested in the disc, please throw something in the chat or write to me or Facebook message me, and I can send it to you. So thanks very much, and see you all soon. One of the things that absolutely I'm very excited about is the possibility that we can start hearing this early music and recent music live back in an actual acoustic as opposed to behind the desk here. So thank you very much, and see you all very soon. So I'm ending the live stream now. Thank you.